All right, I think we'll get started with this evening's presentation. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the information session about the Warehouse District Historic Resource Survey. I'm going to turn this over to Siri Olson. She's from Easton Architects, the consultant working with the City of Albany Planning Department on carrying out the survey. And she's going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you all for attending. This is really always great to have people come out to listen to historic resource discussions. So we've just got a brief presentation. And then, yeah, we really are going to be happy to open it up to some questions and answers. So Erin teed us up nicely. My name is Siri Olson. I'm from Easton Architects. We're a preservation and planning firm that has been hired as a consultant on this project to work with Erin and the City of Albany Department of Planning and Development. So I'm the project manager on this project. And Lisa Easton, who is our partner in charge, who's been a little bit delayed this evening, but maybe joining later, is also on the team. And for this project, we are working closely with the city and then also with the state New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, also known as the State Historic Preservation Office, with James Finelli in that department. So tonight, just give briefly overview. We're going to kind of talk about the project, what it is, what its goals are, talk a little bit about what a historic resource survey means, give a little bit of an introduction into the National Register of Historic Places, talk about the project next steps and what we've done, and then have some time for questions and answers. So for some people, they may be coming to preservation and preservation planning with not a lot of experience. Some of you on the call may be extremely familiar with the National Register and eligibility. So we're going to be kind of talking about a lot of terms, kind of jumping in and out from a broad view to a specific view. And also just want to mention that we'll make a copy of this presentation available online after the meeting, and we'll append another page with some links and places where people can learn more. So to start out broadly, what is this project? It is an intensive level historic resources survey of the Warehouse District. And so this Warehouse District and the project, it really builds upon Albany's Historic Preservation Plan, which is the citywide articulation of preservation goals and preservation work. And in this preservation plan, the Warehouse District was one area that was identified as an area of interest and for future survey. So our purpose is to document existing architecture and determine potential eligibility for listing a historic district in the New York and National Registers of Historic Places. And so our survey work is funded by a Historic Preservation Fund grant, which has been awarded to the city under the Certified Local Government Program. So those are a lot of terms, but basically Albany is a certified local government, which is a program, a national program to participate in preservation planning and preservation funding. So there's a specific pot of money and a specific grant to undertake this kind of documentation and identification work. So where is the survey happening? This is a map that was from the preservation plan identifying future survey areas. So the Warehouse District is, as you see circled in red, is number 20 of 21 total districts and areas of future survey, and ranging in types of potential historic resources, historic themes. And this area was identified particularly for its concentration of 19th and earliest 20th century buildings that are really connected to the city's industrial and manufacturing heritage and are a extant pocket of buildings related to that history. So to zoom in closer to that area on the citywide view, this is the city's survey area map, which is available on the department of Planning and Development's website. And so our survey area is broadly defined around North Broadway and North Pearl Streets, and approximately bounded by Emmett Street, Colony Street, Erie Boulevard, and Tivoli Street on the west. So as you can see, though, these street names are sort of the general parameters, and our survey area is really defined by building typologies and concentrations of buildings that are thematically and historically and architecturally related to each other. So this is the area where we're going to be concentrating and really focusing in on those themes, where the built heritage still exists, and understanding both what's there now and what has happened and changed over time. So our project goals for the survey are to document existing historic buildings, structures, and objects, and features and patterns within the neighborhood. So we're both documenting physical characteristics at the building level and at the neighborhood level. And another goal is to identify a potential historic district or potentially significant individual buildings. This survey area has a number of buildings that are already individually listed on the National Register, but we're going to be identifying if there are any individual properties or a potential historic district there. So we'll be evaluating the significance and integrity of the remaining historic buildings and determining if those buildings meet the National Register eligibility criteria, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then we'll be recommending whether a future historic district boundary could be drawn, and whether or not a historic district or multiple historic districts or collections of individual buildings exists in this neighborhood. There's a lot of potential there, and a lot of previous survey work and evaluation that the planning department has done, that the state has done, that local groups and nonprofits and property owners, a lot of people feel there is something here in this district, and our job is to kind of come in and formally draw a boundary, kind of collect all of that research into a formal recommendation. And so really the big goal is to support through this survey a future nomination of a historic district to the state and national registers, and provide some of the necessary background information and coordination with the New York State Historic Preservation Office, which will formally conduct that listing. So throughout the presentation, you'll see NY SHPO abbreviated, and whenever we say that, we're referring to the State Office Historic Preservation, who are our partners and sort of the first step in formally designating individual resources and historic districts. So for this project, to give everyone an idea of what the results will be, the final products are going to be a survey report, which will be available, a PDF report that talks about our project methodology, provides a historic context narrative about the neighborhood, about these historic themes. It will contain evaluations of what resources may or may not be significant and why. And then we'll have our recommendations for the next steps, including a potential historic district based on our findings. And then the second part will be building data entries into the New York SHPO's database, which is New York CRIS or NY CRIS, the Cultural Resource Information System. So all of the final products and the survey findings are going to be available to the public. The New York CRIS database is online and accessible. So all of this will be available. So then I want to touch on what a survey like this means for a property owner, because we know that sometimes there are a lot of misunderstandings about historic preservation and what designation means, what the different levels mean, and kind of what goes on. So I want to say this sort of top level before we get too much further, is that this survey has no change in what a property owner can or cannot do for their building. This is really an information gathering tool and an opportunity to investigate future opportunities and benefits for historic preservation. So it's a way to gather information about the history of a building and have that publicly available for information purposes, for educational purposes, and then for potential future listing. So the survey really means that property owners may have access to preservation resources and funding if, based on the findings of our survey and our recommendations, a historic district is formally nominated for listing in the New York and national registers in the future. So we know that might bring up a lot of questions, but just want to say that the survey is really about data and information and will not impose any regulatory constraints. So zooming back out to talk about historic resources surveys, we are doing an intensive level survey. So I've included some of SHPO's summaries about what a historic resource survey is. And basically the intensive level survey is a planning tool and a documentation and evaluation tool that's kind of in a middle step in the overall planning and inventory process for historic resources. So most of the time, preservation planning happens at a municipal level, can happen on an individual level, led by nonprofits or preservation groups, property owners, but generally happens at the citywide level. And that's Albany's preservation plan and how its preservation goals fit in with its much broader land use and city planning goals. So sort of that's the big picture in the broad view. And then a reconnaissance level survey is sort of the next step that narrows in a little bit. And that is a much broader stroke survey. So it's really the first step in a process to identify areas and properties that are potentially significant and worthy of further study. So it's often sometimes called a windshield survey because it's got a big broad stroke and it kind of plays off the idea of what you could see from the windshield of a car. So the next level is this intensive level survey, which is where we are now, which is a narrower focus based on those earlier planning and inventory steps. And it focuses more on research. So it does more of a deep dive on a building specific level and on a neighborhood specific level. So we still only kind of look at what's publicly available. We take in sort of the small survey area, and that provides the information and the research that's necessary for determining properties that are individual properties or historic districts that may be eligible for a historic designation. So it's really this combination of broad stroke inventory, take in the historic context as a whole, and then do a deep dive on the research. And then the product of the intensive level survey will be this recommendation for potential eligibility. So the next step is then state and national register nomination or local nomination. That's sort of a side branch that we won't really be talking about today. But that next step is the state and national register nomination, which is an even narrower and even more deep dive on the research and the focus. That's the formal first step. Gets submitted to the SHPO and then to the National Park Service. And then the final result of that would be the actual register designation. So that's the successful nomination of the property. So this is just sort of an illustration of a resource survey as data gathering and evaluation towards future designation. So in that vein of sort of the parallel tasks of documentation and evaluation, in a historic resource survey, it's based on observations from the sidewalk, from the public right of way. So survey members, do not go into private property. It's based on information and data that can be gathered and photos that can be taken from the public right of way. So you gather information on the physical characteristics and the surrounding context. And then the evaluation of the property is based on observations from this field survey, where we identify historic architecture, patterns, unique features, We research potential historic significance, dive into the archives and libraries and the intangible elements of the neighborhood. And then we identify themes of eligibility and buildings that could either contribute or maybe not contribute to a historic district. So this is sort of, there's just a picture, kind of our data collection chart. And we think it's important to highlight, the information that gets collected for a historic survey is really the physical characteristics, and the information that gets put into these public databases is address and data construction, material conditions, architectural style, the height and width and sort of massing of the building. It's documentation of past alterations and additions, its property type and use. So we bring this up to say, it's really about the character of the building, the physical building. We don't collect information about ownership or other information that's used in different, tax assessors purposes and things like that. But this is really focused on the physical attributes, and that's what gets recorded and documented. And so from a historic resource survey, there are a couple steps that can follow from this effort. Mostly it's the nomination of identified buildings and districts to state and national registers. And then after that designation, a step that many buildings take is sort of eligibility and qualifying for rehabilitation grants and tax credits. So another step that can follow from a survey is local designation and potential eligibility for local preservation incentives. And then broadly speaking, the survey report and data is available as an educational resource. And the themes and the property types from this survey may inform other areas of interest for future survey and potential significance. So it's an effort that then can build on other areas in the city and kind of can support this ongoing documentation and evaluation effort. So that's to say that there's a lot of different steps that can come from a historic resource survey and a lot of different benefits. So to give a little bit of an intro into the national registers, in case people aren't as familiar with them, we think it's important to kind of dwell on this because the potential for listing is a major goal of this project. And there can be a lot of misunderstanding about what the National Register is, what different levels of designation are, and what it means to be listed on the National Register. So to zoom out and speak broadly about preservation policy, designation happens at different levels. It can happen at the local level, it can happen at the state level, and national level. So the state and national designations work more closely together. The local processes are much more separate, and in general have the most stringent and unique parameters for designation and regulation. So the New York State and National Historic Registers of Historic Places are official lists of buildings, structures, places that have been recognized as historically significant. So that's maybe pretty obvious to people, but that is their purpose. So our survey is focused on eligibility for listing in the New York State Register of Historic Places and the National Register of Historic Places. And so those two things really go hand in hand. So the City of Albany has its own designation and regulation process for local landmarks and local historic districts. So this is a separate level of designation. Buildings can be listed on the national and state registers and be local landmarks, but they don't have to be. Buildings can be both or one or the other. So the local processes are different in terms of regulation and what they mean for a property. And a survey like ours can inform and be used for local designation purposes, but our focus is really on state and national register. So what does eligibility mean and how is it determined? Basically, it means a building or a district meets certain criteria for significance and that these buildings retain historic integrity. So these are broad level criteria that have been established in national preservation policy and apply throughout the country to the whole National Register program. And so for a district, eligibility really means that there's a concentration of resources that are united by themes of intangible history, of architecture, or historical association that together really represent a significant history. So it's this idea of buildings may not rise to a level of significance on their own, but together they are united and really kind of cohesive in a way that tells a story that an individual building does not. So the National Register criteria for eligibility I've put up on the slide because there are 4 criteria that are used. There's one criterion A is for events related to significant events. Criterion B is for associations with significant persons or people in the American past. Criterion C is design and construction, which is maybe what most people think of right off the bat, is significant demonstrations of certain architectural styles, the designs of significant architects or a master architect, sort of the physical elements. And then criterion D, which is information potential or sort of the archaeology criterion, which is kind of ability to yield future information. So for a building to be, or a district, to be eligible for listing, it has to meet one or more of these criteria. And it also has to retain historic integrity, which is a little bit more of a thorny argument. But basically, the idea of a building or a district retaining integrity is their ability to communicate their reasons for significance. So in order for something to be listed on the National Register, it has to both rise to the level of one of these significance criteria, and it has to still be able to communicate that significance. So there are a couple different aspects of integrity by which that integrity finding is evaluated. It could be, physical properties, design, materials, association. So it's that one can be a little more nebulous, and that's the argument that comes on the consultants, comes on us to make that argument for integrity, make a finding of integrity. And then the SHPO and National Park Service have to agree with that. So to say how our survey findings fit into this eligibility process is that we make a recommendation through our survey to the New York State Historic Preservation Office that a historic district meets the significance criteria and retains integrity. And then SHPO is really the entity that makes the official determination that something is eligible for listing. And from there, the nomination process can continue. So coordinating with SHPO during the survey process is really important because it helps to identify the themes and questions about integrity that they might have, and brings their expertise into this early planning step. And so this leads to a consensus about district eligibility, which then in turn helps future nomination efforts move forward. So the benefits of listing. We love to focus on this because there are a lot of benefits of listing. There's first and foremost is the recognition of important buildings and areas and neighborhoods and spaces in a city. And it makes available information about local history and works as an educational tool. And I feel it's really important to highlight that the National Register program at its core is really about being an information tool and a recognition tool to share information about special historic places throughout the country and to bring in many, many different types of resources and to recognize all the different important areas that are out there. And so another, that's one kind of category of benefit. And then another is that once you are listed on a state and national register, certain properties can qualify for preservation tax credit and grant programs. So the most well-known is the state and federal rehabilitation tax credits program. And the state also has some state preservation groups often have grants available to municipalities or nonprofit owners or certain other kind of commercial buildings. So these preservation incentive programs can be used for rehabilitation, adaptive reuse, restoration, and protection of historic buildings and historic districts. So I say certain properties can qualify because the federal rehabilitation tax credit program is really geared towards income producing properties. So that's usually commercial buildings, has a lot of different iterations. So it's not blanket every property, but most properties, depending on the ownership and the use, will be able to be eligible for some kind of funding or grant program. And so we also it's important to highlight that being listed on the state and national register does not mean that a building cannot be altered, added onto, restored, or even demolished after it's listed. We don't encourage any demolition, but that's where a lot of confusion kind of come up, that being listed does not restrict rights and kind of the ability of a property owner to do what they would like with their building. So if there's no state or federal agency or money involved, and the building is not locally designated, listing on the state and national registers does not in any way sort of limit the owner what they're able to do or add any regulatory approvals to any kind of process. So we mentioned the state and federal agency or money being involved because there are certain policies that if there's federal or public money coming in or you're taking advantage of one of these federal tax credit programs, there is some other coordination and approvals that become involved, but always with the goal of putting the historic buildings back into use and encouraging revitalization, encouraging rehabilitation and retention of the buildings, but keeping them useful in the current, the current life of the city and the neighborhood. So to zoom back into our project, what we've done so far is really been focusing on our field survey and documentation. So if any of you saw our team out earlier in the year with our yellow vests and our photos and our clipboards, we were walking around the entire survey area, taking down information about these physical characteristics. So we're taking photos, doing our field assessment. So we kind of divided this into preliminary lists of probably eligible, not eligible, maybe eligible, needs more research, determining the whole survey area, how we can focus our energies based on physical attributes and then the historic research we've done about, okay, there was a big manufacturing company here and it looks like 6 buildings are surviving from there. So let's focus in on that. So just reminding you sort of where the survey area is. And then in terms of the focus for our survey, and our research, we've been concentrating on industrial and manufacturing and commercial history, which is both kind of based on the reason this survey is happening in the first place and that industrial and manufacturing heritage that the planning department has already identified. And then also what's come up from our conversations with SHPO about what they see as important characteristics and what they see as kind of important characteristics about integrity and evaluations of integrity, documenting what's changed over time for the buildings that remain, and using the extant buildings to kind of craft a narrative about what's still there in the neighborhood and how it tells the story of how it developed over time. So for our, in our next steps, the way this project moves forward is that we are going to continue on, that coordination with Erin's department and SHPO, and that will involve reviews of our preliminary findings, draft reviews of the survey, and draft and alternative options for potential historic districts. So that's that's an ongoing conversation, as well as continuing to research building specific histories, changes over time, and really these themes of technology and manufacturing and local industries, and how that relates to Albany's development overall. And one fascinating thing about this neighborhood is that industrial change over time has always been a characteristic of the neighborhood and has impacted the buildings, and it impacts the buildings that remain. So that's really kind of a character defining feature that in its future is connected to this long lineage of development and industrial change, kind of ebbs and flows of industry. So there's a really nice continuity in this neighborhood of its history and the buildings that remain and what its potential could be in the future. So then when we've completed our survey and our coordination, we'll be presenting these findings and recommendations to the local Historic Resources Commission at a public meeting. That will be advertised and everyone will be welcome to attend. So we'll be informing them of the recommendation. And as a reminder, that Historic Resources Commission is the entity that kind of regulates that local landmarking process. So we will be presenting our findings to them, and then we'll be putting all of our information into that publicly available CRIS database. So just as a reminder that everything from the survey report to the building entries will all be available to the public. And our work is going to be complete by September 30th of this year, if not earlier. And then, we really just want to open it up to some questions and answers. Like I said, we'll be making this presentation available online. And for that, I'll add a couple links where you can go to learn more about the preservation plan, about surveys, about SHPO, about some of the tax credit projects. Those are really interesting in a public information, non-clickable situation, but we'll be adding those. So if you want to learn more, you can. And my contact information is on this slide, as well as Erin's. If you want to send in questions or comments, or have resources about the neighborhood that you want to share, you are more than welcome to do so. So thank you all so much for your attention with all of that. And we absolutely welcome any questions if you have them.
Yeah, so if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand.
I think we graciously had someone offer to be taking notes as well. So thank you, Jackie. I saw that show up in the chat.
Yes.
And this is being recorded as well, so.
Yes.
I should have put a poll together of how many people are familiar with the National Register, how many people,
Yeah, then.
I'm going to be extremely impressed if everyone's like, oh, I already knew all of this information. So participants, if you're listening, and that's you, I'm very impressed.
Just no questions.
Well, I'll just say that, yeah, it's a pleasure to work on this project, and there are so many really interesting things to be exploring. And Erin, it's been extremely helpful to work with you and everyone, everyone we've spoken with at the New York SHPO office is also really excited about this project and have been reviewing all of the individual buildings that have been going through already. And they're really, got tons of ideas about significant themes.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. So Diane is wondering, I own 4 buildings in this district, was told that it was referred to as Film Row. Have you found any information on that history?
That is a very good question. I don't know that I have come across that term yet, actually. But we will look into that. We've been, yeah, more, I think I'm more hearing about building materials, and you can see here the cut stone, the ironworks, piano factories, perforated wrapping paper companies, but that I could easily believe. I will look into it. Thank you, Diane. Oh, storage of film reels and distribution for the film industry. That makes
Interesting.
a lot of sense. Oh, love it. Yeah, thank you. That is a wonderful contribution.
Yes.
Into that. And that's actually a really, you know, that's a really great contribution, because it reminds me too of that, you know, that's a component of manufacturing and industry and distribution that you generally might not think about. And it's really when you can do deep dives on buildings individually or little groups of buildings that you really can find out how much a neighborhood contributed to so many unexpected areas of life.
Yeah. I was at the press release for the redevelopment of Huck Finn's, which is the former Albany Perforated Paper Company, where they manufactured and distributed perforated toilet paper. That's where it all started. So
the SHPO is extremely happy about that project.
Yes, it'll be great. So yeah, very excited about the survey and potential future projects within this area. So it'll be very good for the warehouse district.
Yeah. Oh, there's lots of potential there.
Yes. All right. Well, like Siri said, this is being live streamed on YouTube, and it will be saved there. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions or, you know, any comments, feel free to reach out to me or Siri. This will be going to the City of Albany's Historic Resource Commission once we have the final report for their review, and there will be a open public meeting at that time as well for any future follow-up. So thank you, Siri, for this wonderful presentation. Very, very good, a lot of information for everybody, and we're excited to see where this goes. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for joining. We always appreciate the participation.
Yes, thank you all. All right.